So, before I start, and my name is Kamal Kamal, I'm with Center for Global Policy. I was wondering if we could turn off our phones or put on silence right now. So, do it together. Synchronize our silence. Uh, Only because it may interfere with the PA system. Thank you. And we are live streaming, so that would be very interesting. Welcome to the Center for Global Policy's DC's office. This is the first event in the DC office, and we are really proud to find the space and launch the office here in the midst of many other things happening in DC, but also launching this very important topic of countering violent extremism, CVE, PVE. A few other things. I will introduce our speakers in just a moment. Again, this is a fireside chat, just discussing some key issues of each person's research work. Each speaker has a PowerPoint slide to help us, and we have a human clicker, Mina Jaffari, to help out. So thank you. So, again, if you did not grab coffee or tea, it's still there. So feel free to have some coffee and tea and dessert, anything else you may have missed. You want seconds? We have seconds too. Okay. So we are really pleased to have this event and have two great speakers in this research field, in this discipline, commonly called PVE or CVE, Preventing Violent Extremism / or Countering Violent Extremism. The field itself has evolved with its own name, its own identity, and it's a global identity to it in relationship to it. So that's why you may hear the exchange of the acronyms PVE and CVE. So one of the things behind this conversation was not only have we moved like almost over half a decade in really funding such events globally, but with domestic issues here in the U.S., an emphasis on right-wing extremism and white nationalism, and the presence of other, of course, the maintenance of and if not flourishing of ISIS and Al Qaeda and other places, so that this nexus of this conversation of how are these groups still maintaining their fuel, how are they maintaining to attract, and even though some have claimed ISIS is gone and is no longer a threat, but we see, if not more often, deadly attacks in Syria and Iraq and other places. So what are we to do with this nexus of new resurgence of violent extremism? That is sort of the background of what we were thinking of this conversation. Also, I think does this right-wing extremism lend any similar patterns to other CVE actors, right? VE actors, I should say? Are there continuities? Are there overarching patterns of behavior, of attraction to the ideology, of group belonging? And I think from those lessons that we've been involved in the global CVE world, maybe I think it could be informed the domestic thinking. If not, the world has really emphasized what they call bottom-up approaches to dealing with this Ministry of the Interior, or it's this so-called very hard approach to resolving conflict, resolving extremism, can only go so far. And so the shift of emphasizing civil society, media, women's groups, youth groups, religious communities, academic institutions, and so forth, to emphasize their involvement, their proactive involvement, and sort of help the rest of society become be aware of radicalization trends, or be more self-aware of ideologies in the environment. This sort of bottom-up approach, what was called bottom-up approach at least 5 years ago, is more or less what we call community-based approaches, and become really more sophisticated over time. Sophisticated in understanding the context of all of these community members and all these stakeholders. And what may work in Tunisia, what may work in Iraq, or may work in Morocco, it's really appreciated that it may not work other places. It sounds like an obvious thing to say, but for people who are practitioners and policymakers, there was a tendency to say that this had worked in place X, it can be applied in place Y. So if we do more training, right, of imams, we just do more training of media and bring media and imams together, then this will create a synergy of more self-awareness of radicalization. And I think those assumptions are interestingly important, but they've been contested and discussed and analyzed by two speakers here. And we want to examine how these various approaches, various thinkings of community-based approaches to preventing extremism, violent extremism, is nuanced locally, right? It's nuanced not just by province to province, but local to local. For maybe some places have a religious context, some does not have a religious context. Some may be just the fact that the local governance is horrific, and that's the issue. It has nothing to do with religion or any ideology, and so forth. So it may be just very local, social, political issues. With that in the background, I'm very pleased to introduce our two speakers. Dr. Huda Abadi is here this week from Morocco, and she has an organization in Morocco called Transformative Peace. That's right. And I think it's transformativepeace.org is the website. Yeah, it's up. .com, and it's running. And before that, she had worked at the Carter Center for several years. We are really pleased here at the center to actually publish her work and her findings that she spent several years on in the field in Morocco into various stakeholders on what the sort of the culture and the lure of radicalization and radicalism, what that meant, how was that interpreted, and then what was the response to various communities, and what was the most effective responses to leaders. So if you don't have her work, please. So she will go first today, and with her presentation, and after that we Dr. Peter Weinberger, who we're also very pleased to have, known for several years. He's an expert in many things, but one of the things he's been really working on excessively is how do these approaches, how do these projects actually work? How do we know when they work? So his monitoring, his evaluation, and teaching of these best practices of these projects is extremely important to all of us, because I think it takes a very quantitative and qualitative approach to understanding that. I've also been very much involved with domestic issues, advising and teaching about right-wing extremism in the United States. And he studied that also here, and he's helped various state agencies on that topic too. So after Dr. Huda, we'll have Dr. Weinberger present his work on his analysis of what works and how do we know about it, and which community approaches are more efficient or effective, and how do we know. So no further ado, we'll have Dr. Huda to begin. For the first 15 minutes, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to put my time.
Okay.
Because I tend to talk too much. I want to thank the Global Center for Policy for inviting me, and specifically Dr. Tomat for having me here and publishing the work that I've been working on. So today's presentation, I'll be discussing the grassroots approaches to preventing violent extremism, looking at Morocco specifically. I'll be dividing the presentation into three sections. The first section is really just broad general understanding of how has Daesh been able to recruit more than 100 different countries. What are the propaganda strategies that it uses, and why has it been very effective? The second, then I'm going to go into more of what are some of the challenges of state PVE or CVE. And CVE is such a loaded word that I don't do CVE. I do more community peace building and grassroots approaches to peace building. And then I would want to end and conclude with recommendations or things that have worked. While I was working at the Carter Center for 5 years, I developed and led a program, a grassroots program, that is called Inclusive Approaches to Preventing Violent Extremism that worked with religious and community leaders from Morocco, Tunisia, France, and Belgium, connecting the diaspora, and then the United States. And we looked at not only one form of extremism, which is sometimes very comfortable to look at only Daesh or Al-Qaeda, but we also looked at the rising tide of Islamophobia and the rise of white supremacy, specifically in Europe and the United States. So I want to draw some of that work into the recommendations. So I want to first start with some of the push and pull factors. They're very general, but for the pull factors, a lot of it has to do with feeling of adventure and belonging, freedom to practice true forms of Islam. And this is really interesting from both forms. From the European context with the rise of Islamophobia, Daesh is very, in its propaganda, very hyper-local. So they understand what a lot of the, European Muslims or even Americans are going through. I mean, they use that in their propaganda. So we can see how Daesh uses Islamophobia to recruit, actually. But we also see that Islam in majority Muslim countries where there is a fear of Salafi community networks, people that dress much more conservatively, where they feel that they are being targeted by the state. And so here again, Daesh uses that to say, if you come here, and of course this is propaganda, you're able to come and practice for financial advancement. Also marry and start a family. It sounds weird, but in a lot of contexts, it's very difficult for young men to get married, specifically when there's these cultural obligations and they don't have the financial resources. And then there's also the concrete offers of status to Daesh. You can see if we look at specifically Morocco, there are many cases where some of the youth that went there were nothing. And one of the mothers in Belgium, she said, my son went from zero to a hero in one day, where he was nothing. And he felt that he didn't have any dignity, wasn't able to have any prospects in life, and Daesh was able to offer him a status very quickly. But we also have the push factors, which are the social and political exclusion, the lack of belonging and social stigma, weak and failed states, and more. So we have to be very careful also with the foreign policy and what we're doing in the Middle East and in North Africa and how we contribute to violent extremism at large. The approach, which I'm going to discuss as well. And so for Daesh, one of the things that has been really interesting is that it has brand, and it tried to talk the language of young people. And we can see through a lot of its media, it uses different languages, different vernaculars, in the to deconstruct Daesh propaganda, looking at 30 different variables. So we analyzed more than 800 Daesh videos, and we have seen how they use, they're very hyper-local, but they also use different languages, images. It's very high-tech, it's very quick, so you're not very. But I want to make sure we talk about the online and we feel like, okay, oh my gosh, Daesh is just focusing their wars only on the online to preventing Daesh. We have to look at how does the online they work together, how they converge, how do they contract, and how do they work with, how does the audience also receive Daesh messages? Why in some cases, some people can watch Daesh videos and they're not radicalized. Why in some cases they are, and how does it work in the local context specific? So in the interviews that I've conducted in Morocco, they were telling me that, sometimes it's as simple as watching television and looking Aleppo burning, Syria, and not having any recourse, feeling they're not able to do anything to help what's happening in Syria. And if you're looking at the first wave that went to join to fight for Syria, they didn't even join Daesh. It wasn't even like an entity of itself as we understand it right now. And they were trying to just, bring down Bashar al-Assad and thinking that they're going to go there to help the Syrian brothers and sisters. So we also need to look at the time chronology of the foreign fighters that have joined Syria as well when we're thinking of what types of rehabilitation also and reintegrations models we're going to be using. And we see also that many have, no, how Daesh print media basically, it circulates offline. So in a lot of times they say, well, we got a clip of, this particular Daesh media magazine, and then they're showing it to us. And one of the things that is very important for us is to focus also on how the offline relational networks work. It's very, very important, the emotional appeals that Daesh uses, the relationships that it builds. So it can't be something very just on the online. In terms of people working, that's why in some communities, for example, in northern Morocco, you see they join Daesh. Relational connection that plays a very important role. And then we can look at the social platforms. A lot on cultural codes. And so sometimes when you read their propaganda, and they're referring specifically, say, to Tunisian in the US, only the person from that particular country will understand. So there is an example of how they were trying to recruit the United States and they on, African Americans. And they're like, look at how, look at racism in the United States if you become humor. But they also focus a lot on the emotional. And so you can see there's an image, one of the Daesh fighters holding a cat, and there's a description. He's like, I'm walking down, and there's this little kitty that came, and there's this human connection and starts to narrate about how you need to take care of a pet. So they're trying to make it very human, very emotional connection. So, and a lot of times our responses have been very cognitive, very much rational. You cannot join Daesh. This is, it's un-Islamic. And a lot of their propaganda does not focus only on the rational or on the ideology. And this is why I want to show this. So these are some of the 7 main narratives that Daesh uses to recruit. I can't go because of time in each one, but I want to show you, I want to say 3 things. One is that there's 7, it's multimodal. So there's 7 main arguments or narratives that Daesh uses. The second one is that religion or ideology is a minority percentage. It's a very small percentage. In 2015, it was only 6% because they're losing territory and they want to say God is on our side. It increased from 6 to 8, which is still very, very low. So most of our responses have been so focused on this is a religious issue. We need to train imams. It's a religious, we need to do wasatiyah. So we got it all wrong from the get-go. And this is one of the things that I really want to focus on. It also shows that these narrative changes within time. So our responses when we are doing PVE has to adapt to the local context and to what is happening right away at that instant. And a lot of times it takes us years to be able to, like Daesh is super quick, and it takes us years to be able to catch up with what they're trying to do. They're also very gendered in their recruitment, and so you have the Khansa Brigade where they say you are of us and we of you, and they have specific gendered appeals that make women, and you can see like Daesh is a misogynistic terrorist organization, yet it was able to appeal to women, and so we have to understand how and why, and Daesh also tries to use traditional gender roles to invoke guilt, to say, look, these women have been, look how brave they are. They joined us, and look at you men, weak men. You have to come too. If women can do it, then you can do it as well. So that's something else that they try to challenges in preventing violent extremism in North Africa, because this goes and takes us back to the practical level. So we have the closing of political space. What does this mean? It means that the space is too politicized, and in some cases also terrorism is very racialized, that we don't have the right response back. So a lot of civil society actors don't have space to be able to directly work in this field. So they, instead of saying, for example, we have a PBE program and we're working with young people from neighborhood A, they have to reframe their program and say, oh, we're working with youth on civic engagement, because if they do, they will be in trouble. The second thing that this means is, out of the religious and faith-based and community leaders we spoke with from North Africa, when I asked them, have you ever watched a Daesh propaganda video? Do you know how Daesh recruits? Around 95% of them said, no, we've never watched it because we're worried that if we watch it, we will be considered that we are radicalized as well. And so when you don't know something and you don't know how that, that entity recruits, how can you offer solutions? And so a lot of times they fall into the same bait, and they focus also on thinking that it's a religious issue, and so we're going to just issue. And in some countries, we see also that the government has a monopoly of religious affairs as well. And so what can be said is also monitored. There's the second one is a lack of comprehensive reintegration and rehabilitation programs. And what it means is there's a lot of community stigma. So now that these people have come, community stigma not only to the people that have joined Daesh, but also to the families that they have left behind. And a lot of times those families, they lose their jobs, they're unable to, in Tunis, for example, there were mothers that did not get out from their homes for more than 6 months because they were so embarrassed because their sons had joined Daesh. So it plays a huge role. And there's also many times the reintegration programs focus on ideological de-radicalization. But when it's not ideology that is the problem, then how do we think that this is going to be an effective kind of a rehabilitation reintegration program? And then we see that there's the embassy imams. I call them embassy imams, and what I mean on training imams, and it's imams that go from embassy to embassy to embassy, and you see them in television, but they have zero legitimacy. I mean, absolutely zero. And so here we go, we're putting so much money, and we put so much money on counter narratives, and we think that counter narratives is a narrative issue, and it's just money down the drain, where a lot of times the messenger is, how do you be effective in the first place? Lastly, the structural inequalities. We see a lack of a poor educational system that leads to a lack of critical thinking, but we also see toxic masculinity. Kamari, you were saying about the similarities between it. This toxic masculinity is also seen within the far right, within their propaganda as well. So these are some of the issues that we are dealing with. Yeah, so I just want to, because I reached my 15 minutes, very quickly to just finish my recommendations. Basically, in this work, trust is the main currency. And so if there is not trust, you are unable to do this work effectively. CVE and PVE are very, specifically CVE is a very loaded term. There's a lot of baggage, a lot of history. The way we understand terrorism has also been very politicized, very racialized. And so we really need to understand the local context and respect the cultural and religious norms of the communities we work with. As I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, I've been leading a project at the Carter Center when I was with them on inclusive approaches to PVE. And one of the religious leaders said, this is the first time that we're talked to and not talked at, or we're not she said, rat labs. And so a lot of times we have the best of intentions, but it does not translate within the community level as well. We should also avoid a sole focus on extremism. A lot of money has been put on Daesh type or on Muslim or this Muslim form of extremism. where we know that there's also a rising tide of Islamophobia in the West. There's white supremacy groups now in the United States have grown much more. It's much more of a threat. And so how can we go into European context or even in the United States and say, oh, we need to fight Daesh, where we know it's more of a minimal risk and there's a larger risk that we're not talking about. And so we really have to be able to reflect from within and see, okay, how can we ensure that we're looking at a comprehensive perspective as well? There's no one size fits all. And so what might work in one country might not work in another country. We have also seen that what might work in one country in the north might not work in that same country in the south. And so we have to be very specific and really get to understand and map the local context. Who are the political stakeholders? How is the political environment affecting the types of programs that we are running or not running, and ensuring that we basically do no further harm to the communities that we're engaging with. We also have the engage with not only mainstream but also with conservative. A lot of, especially in the West, between Sunni and Shia divides, but we also need from a Sunni to Sunni perspective. In the work that I've been leading, it was the first time that groups, Muslim leaders from community leaders and faith-based leaders, for the first time were sitting in the same room. They've known each other, they know each other in television, but they were never brought together. And so there needs to be a conscious effort in trying to create an intra-Muslim dialogue as well. And I've showed in the previous slide how Daesh has a gendered component in terms of its recruitment. And so, of course, we also need a gendered response in our PBE. And that means from not just, having a checklist and say, okay, we're good, we have the gendered, like we have women, but what does it mean to have a gendered approach to PBE? For me, the way I understand it is also to look at what is the role that men play and how is manhood enacted. How is the manhood enacted? How is toxic masculinity understood? When we bring experts, are we ensuring that we have women experts? So when we really look at the gendered approach to PBE, we really need to understand it from not the substance, but also in terms of how we organize our activities outside. The number 7 is how we need to empower, build capacity, but most importantly, ensure local ownership. That these community leaders that we work with, or local leaders, feel that these are their projects, that it's theirs. They have a stake at it. It's not a Carter Center project. It's not a UN project, but it's their project, and they have a stake. And this is something that is meaningful for them. And so one of the ways to do this is to create and spend time in creating this culture of a sense of belonging and that they have a say and a voice and agency. I already mentioned, so I'm not going to go, but we need to move beyond counter narrative. Our communities, why are dying instead of living? We have to think about that and try to deconstruct it. And lastly, persistence and commitment. This is not easy work. We're not going to function within a year, months. It's a long road ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Huda. A lot of rich material in your presentation. I know you just gave us a skim, brief review of it, and we know that there's a lot more to add. And whatever we did miss, we'll bring it up in the Q&A. So, Dr. Weinberger, we'd love to hear your work and what you think of the best approaches. Understand what is the best approach for your research.
Thank you to Dr. Huda and to CGP for inviting me. By way of introduction, I say that I work for Resonance, which is a global consulting firm. We do a lot of work in international development and international security for United States government and other clients. So I'm going to speak about my work working for Resonance, and previously as an academic at the University of Maryland. I worked at the START Center, which is a research center that focuses on counterterrorism. So I have been working on field of P or CVE for about 6 years. And my background is interesting. I'm sort of a bridge between an academic and a practitioner. So for many years I was a university professor, and then I worked in design programs related broadly to conflict resolution. What happens when you're trying to do a development or a conflict resolution initiative in a country where there has been identity-based conflict, for example, and when it's difficult to do a functional or technical program because there are deep grievances between two different sides. So my background and interest in that led me to work in the PCVE field, precisely for the reason was that funders and others in the US government were saying, we're not quite sure what goes into designing one of these programs, much less evaluating one of these programs. So how can we begin to think about it conceptually? How can we know if it's having any impact? So my interest in designing and evaluating these programs came initially from my own observations, working on conflict resolution programs and on the earlier PCVE programs. And one of the things that I noticed is that the programs, they weren't necessarily fair, but they had kind of a finite utility or a limited effectiveness. That they would start off and there would be some enthusiasm for them, but they would plateau at a certain point. So one of the things that I was interested in uncovering was why these programs were plateauing and what we might do to increase their effectiveness. And I began to suspect, this is just anecdotally, that one of the reasons that the programs were not being effective was that the intended beneficiaries may have had trauma or traumatic stress. And I began to think a lot about what that might mean for tweaking or fixing programs. So someone as a background as a researcher and academic, one of the first things that I began to do when I was looking at designing these programs, and this was actually in a domestic United States context, was to say, what does the data tell us? Now, oftentimes we'll think about designing programs for people who've been radicalized to violence or people who are susceptible to extremism. What does the data actually tell us? And it makes sense, for example, from a research perspective, if you think about behavioral health or medical health, if you went to a physician, you want them to know your medical history to be able to help you. So when I began to look at the data, one of the things that was extremely interesting was that I began to notice that a considerable percentage of persons who were radicalized to violence, who became far-right extremists, this is the first group of data that I saw, for people who experienced trauma as young persons in their childhood. So I began to think, well, what does that mean in terms of their own pathways to violence? But more importantly, what does that mean in terms of rehabilitating them and preventing others from going down that road? So I should qualify and say that I'm not someone who believes that if someone is victimized, for example, that it's not their fault, because I think people who commit violence have to own what they've done. But I also believe that this perspective is extremely helpful because it helps us to understand perhaps why people get fixed or stuck into a certain pathway and how we can help them get out. So I began really interested to look at that. The other thing that I began to do as I was working more on international programs was to see the data that I had about, for example, people who became foreign fighters to groups like Daesh, what were their profiles, their personal profiles. And some of the data that I saw was coming from security services and others within European Union countries, for example, also pointed to a similar profile, looking at 40 to 60% of persons having some issue related to trauma or mental health. So what that meant for me is to think about what does trauma mean? So this is actually a slide I once developed for a US government funder who wanted to know how I could explain trauma simply. So one of the things I was once told that if I could unpack a concept and explain it in one PowerPoint slide, I would do really well in policy circumstances. Yeah. So it was a challenge for me a few years ago to do it, but this is a way to really explain what's going on in trauma. So I should say that we use this term a lot, trauma or traumatic stress, and people generally have an understanding of what it means. Really, I'm using understandings that are coming from neuroscience over the last 20 years really fascinating insights that we've come to learn about as a result of new studies, brain scans, for example, about what happens when people are traumatized. And one of the things that we've learned is that we often use terms like, for example, psychosomatic. We'll say like, oh, someone is mentally ill or is disturbed and that's affecting what's going on in their body. Begin to think about trauma, it's actually more important to perhaps think about what we might call somatopsychic, in the sense that the body and the mind is affecting the mind, and that the relationship between the body and the mind are more intimate than we ever understood. And that's the key insight to understand what's going on in trauma. I have at the top of this slide a quote by Dr. Bessel van der trauma healing programs. And when he says the body keeps the score, it's a way to encapsulate people that I'm coaching or working with. What that means, I'll say, the simplest way to understand it is if you think of the term a gut feeling, right? Everyone knows that term. It's a deeply felt, visceral feeling that's in your body and in your mind, right? It's not just a thought you have, it's something that you feel that's very much a part of you and it shapes you. The question that we need to grapple with when it comes to trauma is what if that gut feeling is incorrect, so to speak? Or what if it's not a real understanding of what's going on in the present, but it's an echo of something that happened in the past that's continuing in our body, and the person doesn't understand it. In that sense, this means grounded in the present, and what they're experiencing is perhaps something that has passed, the danger that's passed, they don't understand it. And that is essentially what's going on in traumatic stress. This little chart explains what's going on. Essentially, that when we experience an overwhelming event, like a shock to our system, it could be physical violence, it could be something else. What happens is that our bodies encode that experience, right, within our system. So essentially, whatever happens physically in your body during an overwhelming event, a part of your brain will remember it, right? So if you think about something like butterflies in your stomach or all the blood rushing to your fingers or your extremities, the brain will remember this, right, as a way to protect you, right? The issue that is so challenging for people is they don't necessarily understand that this is a survival mechanism that our brains have developed over hundreds of thousands of years, right? So what happens is we don't consciously remember what's going on. Instead, whenever we have, after this overwhelming event, any of the physical feelings that occurred during the original time, right, it can set off a sense that a danger is recurring, right? So what happens is in a millisecond, right, in the thousandths of a second, the brain says potential danger, releases hormones into the blood, and the person feels a very palpable threat. They're in danger. I was saying earlier, what if your gut feeling, though, is in a sense not grounded in the present, right? So when we talk about trauma healing, we often talk about being embodied, right? So one of the issues with trauma is that people may go their entire lives and not really understand what's going on. And part of trauma healing is very much related to this, in the sense that we make people have what we call bodily awareness or interoceptive awareness, to understand what's going on in their brain and their body, to understand that what they're experiencing, right, may not be what they understand as in their gut feeling. Right? The question is, what is the relationship between this understanding and a radicalization to violence? Right? Because many people experience trauma and do not become violent extremists and terrorists. And many people experience trauma and are, I would say, resilient. They bounce back. That's the very definition of resilient. Given that the data points to large instances of people having experiences of trauma, we must begin to think about designing programs that are meant for PCVE purposes that are trauma-informed. Right? So to get to that, out of this point, there is no kind of one-size-fits-all approach, but the trauma-informed perspective is significant, right? It's highly significant. So one of the things that I was really interested in doing was seeing if there was a community, for example, that recognized that trauma has very much played a part of radicalization to violence, and they wanted this specific perspective in terms of designing approaches for PCVE, what would that entail? So one of the projects that I have been involved with my company Resonance worked with another company, FHI 360, which was involved in a series of pilot programs throughout Middle East and North Africa relating to community-based approaches to preventing and countering violent extremism. And because they were pilot programs, it meant that there was some wiggle room to be experimental. Because they were across the whole region, it meant that no one approach was the same. But one of the things that I found really fascinating was that one of our partners, which was a civil society organization based in Libya, specifically said, we would like to take a trauma-informed approach because we experienced a brutal regime for many years, and now we've experienced some upheaval. And our speculation is that trauma is a factor, and we don't know how that should inform programs. So what I did working with them was to design a toolkit for trauma-informed approaches to preventive violence. The next slide is just a snapshot of the cover page. So this was funded by the U.S. Agency for International Development, Middle East Bureau, as part of this program. And so what I did was very much had to use this kind of dialectic that Dr. Aberdeen was talking about. What's the balance or the tension between giving good practices or best practices to a community that wants to understand how to develop their own program, but still respecting their voice? So what this toolkit was about was essentially a 3-day training and several 50, 60-page toolkit that very much reflected that previous slide. It was basically saying to community leaders from Libya, I went to Tunis to train them, this is what is going on in the brain and the body during traumatic stress. And this is how it may relate to radicalization and violence. And this is how it may relate to PCDD programming. What do you think? So it gives them a lot of suggestive approaches, and they're able to kind of come together with that. So kind of together kind of co-created or came up with a program. For me, it was one of the most meaningful and significant things that I've done in my career. Particularly because it's not just explaining what goes on during trauma, but I included in the toolkit stuff from behavioral health that's been developed in the last 15 years that actually can be taught. And what's really fascinating about the brain is that its capacity to resilience. People can have traumatic stress for 50, 60 years, and once they understand and they work with someone, they can actually completely return to baseline and stop it, right? They can actually heal. This is absolutely fascinating. We were designed for resilience. So to both be able to teach community stakeholders about this, and show them what this looks like, and then help them to design something that works in the community. For me, it was extremely, extremely moving. It's challenging as well. And one of the ways that I explain it to people is saying, I used to be a university professor, and I tried to always be an engaging speaker, engaging lectures. I always used to hate when I had to give lectures early in the morning, because I felt that no matter how excited I was, the students were just not interested. And finally, it occurred to me that there's actually an analogy there for trauma, because it relates to the body in the sense that if I try to teach someone something, and they're too tired or too hungry, their body is not really going to go along with the lesson. Same thing applies to trying to help traumatized populations. Even if you develop a methodology, a framework, a community-based framework that reflects their values, and that can be used to help understand why people radicalize and how to prevent that. The traumatized, again, their body is not going to help them to understand. Both the people who are champions, community leaders, but the intention stakeholders. So in these instances where there's a willingness to accept it, where people recognize it, I think there's an alignment. The question is, what does that look like in practice, and how can we actually recommend that, since each community is different? And so one approach that I suggest is actually building on a lot of the work that has been developed in the United approaches to PCDE, is that there have been professionals, people who are medical professionals, public health professionals, who have suggested that this is the best way to develop this. In other words, when we talk about violence prevention in communities, for example, that this same basic methodology can be used for PCDE interventions. So when public health is something that's basically saying, we're talking about a danger to the community. It could be a biological disease. It could be a contagion like pollution. right? It could be a violence epidemic, it could be toxic masculinity. How do we identify how it's affecting our community? And how do we design effective interventions? So it's basically a twofold approach. The community working with public health professionals identify what are risk factors and what are protective factors. What are those things that endanger the community? And what are those things that strengthen the community? Taking that basic approach, it's possible to design interventions. So, people work in public health joke, they say, first rule is don't go in a toxic environment. For example, polluted layperson. Second rule is if you're in it, get out. Right? But that's basically a way to think about designing PCBs from a public health perspective, to align this understanding of trauma-informed programming with public health programming. And in these instances, the community's voice is heard, but it provides them with kind of a roadmap to go. So I think there's always a tension to caution against parachuting into any community and telling them what to do. But I think as someone with a background in education, it's helpful to give a framework. I have designed and worked with practitioners to design PCVE programs in the United States, places like Akron. I always experience this is people say, we don't have expertise in this topic. We don't have an understanding of how to implement this topic. And I always say to them, do you have educators in your community? They say yes. Like, do you have youth counselors in your community? They say yes. So, do you have public health professionals in your community? They say yes. Then you have the key skill sets that are already there. And the key is redomaining or giving people additional insights and training so that can be used for the PCV program. If it's done in a respectful way, and it's done in a way that generally respects their voice and hears their voice, it can be done, but it's still a challenge. But I think that these new insights from public health and science offer a way forward for communities that want help and that need guidance.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Peter. We're going to take several questions. Of course, it's a conversation, and I'm just going to initiate. Of course, if you have a question or a comment, just raise your hand, and we'll post it. Before we ask the audience members their question, I just have a few things on top of my mind, just to sort of bring these conversations together, or maybe it's not worth it, but because they're so distinct. With the things that are coming out from both of your presentation is the stakeholders themselves, right? So Huda spoke about, be very conscious of the push and pull factors, be very aware of the, the 10 recommendations of, you're not speaking at them, they should be heard, be persistent, not lecture them, maybe extract information from them and they can be informative. Right? So you really talk that the stakeholders have far more of a role, ownership of their own community programs. Is one major argument you're making. And Peter, you're also saying that it's not just the programs that we have moving from ideology to politics or to culture and religion, but to really think about it from a public health problem, that many of these who are lured into these groups, whether it be in the United States or overseas, you interview foreign fighters, that they're already their body is already fertile for such things because they've been traumatized in one way or another. But we only know about their attraction to it once they're at the point. So the question is, the stakeholders is, well, how do these individuals become aware of what's pushing them to these radical communities? I mean, do they only know about the trauma post-entry or in the process of these sort of discussions or PVE projects? So that's my question about the stakeholders itself. That's what I'm really interested in learning on what you think their role is. Or is it you call it a dialectic? Is it such a dichotomy? Is it those who are funding, those who are training, those who are practitioners, the government, and then the community folks? is this dichotomy very strong, or will there be a shift in who actually owns these projects and programs? You have your mic. We'll give this to you.
It's a great question. One of the things that I think is important is to think about, we hear this term a lot, resilient communities. But what does that mean? I think that a resilient community is one that means where people are what's going on in their communities and aware who's at risk, right? So in any given community, important stakeholders will be aware of young people who are at risk for violence, at risk for antisocial behavior, at risk for illegal drug use, for example, at risk for a whole host of things. So when we think about designing community interventions, we can think about what the community does to identify people who are already at risk, right, for those sorts of things. As someone who worked in education, for example, if I saw that a student was doing repeatedly poorly on their examinations, we would do an intervention to try to help them, right? So that's the idea of kind of an early warning system, right? So to identify, the community is trying to identify what does it look like when people are at risk and how can we do interventions to help them. The other thing to think about is what happens if someone does something that is serious, which you can do an intervention to help them afterwards. So when we think about what that entails, and that's kind of reframing what prevention means, right? We talk about public health categories of kind of primary and secondary and tertiary prevention. Do you just warn people beforehand? Do you do an early intervention? Excuse me, if someone is at risk and showing risk behavior, or do you kind of really get involved with someone when they've demonstrated behavior that's very serious? How do you help someone afterwards if they admitted that they've done? But there are ways to think about it. And that's one of the things that's important to think about. For me, one of the things that I think is very helpful from this prevention perspective is to use these new insights from neuroscience that are related to trauma healing. Because the same kind of techniques that can be used to help people heal in their brain and their bodies can prevent them from getting trauma to begin with. When I began studying this from a scientific perspective, I was fascinated. And so I'm very empirical, and I said, okay, let me do these things to see how it's affecting me. And it made me extremely calm. I used to be much more anxious than I am now. I took my anxiety from like a 9 of 10 down to a 2 of 10. And stuff works. And I think it's fascinating to show people that it works. So those things can be embedded in programming, education programs, and public health programs as a preventative factor, and that's one way to think about it. But they can also be embedded in programs that are to rehabilitate. So when we think about risk factors and protective factors, they're signs of the same thing. They're signs of the same kinds of interventions that are needed to help people. We shouldn't only think about preventative or punitive, but we should think about how they work together holistically.
What answer?
What am I going to add? For me, I think local community ownership is absolutely important, and specifically also the process is super important. So in the programming that I've done working with community leaders from 5 different countries, after 3 years, it was reiterative. So in a lot of PBE programs, you kind of train, say, 60 leaders, and then that's it. And you're like, okay, we trained 60 and it's good for the donor. But we have the same group of people over a 3-year period. And the attendance level was still at 90%, which is pretty good. And one of the things that we've done is we say that you know your communities best. And so we're not there to tell you how, we're just giving you the skill set and the tools to be able to do the work, and we can support you. We will support you in how you think you need to support it. And so a lot of times we have an agenda, and it's like a 3-day workshop training, and we have daily evaluations. By the first day evaluation, we read it after they leave, and we have to change for the second day. So it's very quick response back. And within this program, they developed, the local community leaders developed more than 50 local projects, community projects in their local countries, where they're the ones that are implementing it We did not tell them what they should do, who they should, work with. But they came up and said, we are good at this. These are the communities that we think.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, you have a question?
Yes.
Can you tell us your
Nasir.
name and so we know who you are?
My name is Nasir and I work for Indus. It's an EC-based nonprofit. It's more like a comment, but you can also comment on my comment. Uh, uh, Basically, militants, especially IS, they use religion as a major tool for jihad and to impose their brand of Islam. So I think that we can also use religion, Islam, to counter their narrative. Because if we look at the initial sayings of Prophet Muhammad, like you should not kill children, you should not kill minorities, you should not kill unarmed people, and there's a long list of that. And if we teach those things to children or to people who are our audience by saying what Daesh is doing and what actually Islam is preaching, and by that I guess we can also take some help from that. And next, there is a role of political administration. Like non-profits, they have their role and they are playing good role, but their outreach cannot be as much as governments and law enforcement agencies can have. So they should also sensitize people to stay away from radicalize and the way they use their methods uh, in like radicalizing and making people more sensitive to radicalize a brand of Islam and by recruiting them. So, do you think that these things can be more helpful?
So the question we have is on back to counter narratives, having religious folks or religious communities take ownership of the religious counter narratives and again propel that, and or maybe a partnership between state and civil society to make sure there's a complete reach throughout the country and region.
Very quickly, I think, like I mentioned before, that religion plays a minor role. I really believe that. So if you look at Bin Laden's manifesto, most of it was political grievances. He was not trying to talk about how Islam, you should, go to jihad because it's a Muslim duty. But a lot of it was political grievances. I'm not saying that ideology doesn't play a role. It plays a role, but it's a minor role. So if in Daesh videos, and we've analyzed more than 800 of their propaganda, and only, while they use religious terms, only 8, or let's say 10% were specifically focusing only on a religious narrative. Most of them were like a sense of belonging. If you come here, we're able to provide law and order. You're able to, you will feel like you're one of us. And so we have to be careful with how much importance do we give to ideology. And one of the problems, even internationally, is we focus so much on ideology that we are not looking at local governance, we're not looking at corruption, we're not looking at things that affect day-to-day lives of people. And I have people that I interviewed that said, I don't care, like suicide is haram in Islam, that's why I'm not committing a suicide. But I have no meaning to, not because, so it has nothing to do with religion, but the offer that Daesh or any other extremist organization is giving is more than what their community, what is provided. I agree with you. I think there needs to be a bridge. There's a divide now, and there's a lot of mistrust as well between civil society and government. And I think there is a role, each one has a role to play, and needs to be more like bridging the divide between the two and having conversations. But unfortunately, in many of the countries, the political space is very narrow, that a lot of the CSOs don't even have really a formal role to play.
I would say that there's a space for messaging from religious leaders, but I believe, in my experience, that the messaging has to be done in a way that reflects the trauma-informed understanding, right? So if you think about it, if someone is traumatized, and that fear and anger section of their brain is on overdrive, and then they feel this gut feeling, this visceral feeling that they're in danger. If you have positive messaging in that environment, the person may not understand how it's intended, right? So there has to be an alignment of the message and the trauma-informed past is when I worked with people from Libya, they understood this. There was someone who was involved in this kind of messaging in his community. And he said, I understand, I can tell people, I can tell from the Quran, Hadith, and give all of these learned explanations. But people are not willing to understand, to listen to it, because their bodies are in this state of traumatic frenzy, right? And until they can get to a calm state, it's the only way that can message to them. So the role for the messaging has to be done in the right context.
Thank you. Sarah, you got a question?
Yes, I'm Sarah Saeed from the State Department. My question is to Dr. Huda regarding the community approaches and that that you mentioned offline and online. And I'm specifically interested in the community that you mentioned in Morocco where everybody was radicalized. What is your experience looking at peer-to-peer approaches, engaging youth, and what are some good examples that you've seen in there or in other areas of your research? Thank you.
I think a lot of the community leaders' interventions that they're implementing, thank you for your question, that are implementing the local projects are doing peer-to-peer education because they're more willing, like I said, a lot of times the messenger plays more of a role than the message itself. And so when you have someone that you can identify with, you can trust, they talk your language, they are hip and fun, and understand, what you're going through, which really makes sense, then they're more willing to take the message and to kind of understand it. They're also at the beginning, a lot of the community leaders wanted to do just an online, so like building an online platform, and then at the end of the project, they realized, no, we're doing it the wrong way, we're changing. Because it's not just online, but we have to also build relational networks. So in Tunis, for example, there were women who went to the border towns between Libya and Tunis to be able to build programs specifically with women, building resilience there. And the context there is very different from, like inner city Tunis as well. There's one specific incident in Tunis where I did a focus group, and I can't remember the neighborhood in Tunis. It's one of the most impoverished neighborhoods in Tunis. No, it's not the one I'm thinking of. It'll come to me. But I told them, raise your hands. There were around 25 young Tunisians, and I'm like, raise your hand if you know someone who wants to Daesh. If you know one person, and they all raised their hands, and then 2 people, and then they all raised. And then it's like up to 5 people. And it was amazing how the local networks play a huge role. But the youth, when I was talking to them, they said, there's a lot of promise, It's important, narratives are important, but what are we doing in this area? We don't have anything. We don't have any hope in this area. So yes, there are these programs, PDE programs now that, are funded by the West. But what are we taking from this? How are we going to improve ourselves? And we feel that we have been used because now everyone talks about youth, but what are we receiving on the receiving end? I think it's just a buzzword. So we have to really think about, okay, when we talk about engaging and empowering youth, what do we mean by it? And how do we ensure that youth feel that there is an outlet, a real outlet, and not just something we put on the piece of paper?
You have a question?
There was a bullet in your presentation, practicing a new form of Islam. I'd like to know how is it different to the traditional Islam? And second, there was a bullet on Morocco as a case study. I would like to know a little more about that. Can you elaborate?
Do you recall that bullet on some sort of reform Islam or reform approaches? She doesn't recall that bullet, but Morocco is, you can speak more to it, is really invested a great deal of imam training centers and all these sort of activities of having imams nationally pulled into broader issues than just religion, and to think about social issues and economic issues and other issues to sort of broaden their thinking and education. And also Morocco has also been leading the way with female imams to be sheikhas, to be religious leaders in their community. So I think the king has invested in a great deal of a somewhat of a self-critical thinking Islam in Morocco. I'm not sure how much of it's been studied, and those who are there sort of see this happening. But how it transfers or transmits into communities, that's another question. I don't have that data to really support that. Yeah.
I can fill it out.
You Bill, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, please. Bill
So
Lawrence.
it's the Murshidat, is what you're talking about,
Right.
not Sheikhs, which you know. And Amy Wayne Scott wrote a book. She was a fellow at USMP, and she's at Florida, I forget which university, on Morocco's war on terror, and
Right.
gets into a bit into the unique aspects of the Moroccan program, which you can address as well. So, should I hand it back to you?
Well, what do you think? I mean, is it too much to say Morocco is leading and paving a new way, or the kingdom is leading a new way in sort of a very self-critical thinking Islam, or is that just propaganda, or is that just the machinery that tells various other local states that we're doing so much more to have a holistic approach to religion?
I mean, there's some, maybe you should read the article. The answer is in the article. I'm kidding, but there are some things that are positive, like I think the fact that women are empowered to take the sphere of, to enter the sphere of religion. The Morshidat programming is absolutely something that is important and good and positive. And there's some very good things that are working, but there's some things that are still in the process of being figured out. The case of Morocco is trying to lead in terms of PVE. There's the Murshidat, but there's also Rabita Muhammadiyya. There's many local programs trying to respond to the threat of violent extremism. There's some that are positive, and there's also some challenges that I speak about specifically in the article.
For the next question, I just I'll get to you in a second. This whole question comes up as, where are these PVE programs situated? Right? Are they situated in the Ministry of Religious Affairs, Ministry of Interior? I mean, is the Ministry of Public Health or Health at all involved in any of the programs you studied, Peter? I mean, if it's, let's say, it has to be housed somewhere, right? If it's housed in the Ministry of Interior or Ministry of Education, is there an all society approach where you have members from each department and agencies at least come to this sort of national strategy? Or is it just if the Ministry of Intelligence is running it, then they'll just occasionally bring in someone from Ministry of Education, or the 80% is given to Ministry of Religious Affairs? So what, in your experience, these national strategies, are they really holistic, or is it still compartmentalized and still a turf war between amongst different departments and ministries?
So the best practices from international think tanks and others, or places like Hadaya Center in Abu Dhabi, say that there needs to be, as an all PCBE program, a real difference between this and traditional policing and counterterrorism.
Yep.
So there absolutely needs to be an interface between people who are involved in this programming and the authorities. That these programs should not be run by the security services, and that there has to be a real division between them to be effective. In some countries, the programs are run kind of in health ministries or public health ministries, and other places like Mali and West Africa, their programs are run by the Ministry of Religious Affairs. The recognition is that this is where we have to do it, but there has to be training for them to do it. And training. So, I think a lot of times international community will say, we will pay for you to have a national framework for CVE, and the country will come up with one, and it will be embedded in the ministry. It's not enough just to have the framework. It has to be implemented. It has to be done in a thoughtful way. In some places like Kosovo and the Western Balkans, they brought in a lot of consultants to help them do it, and they're making some success. In other places in North Africa that I'm aware of, the CVE or PCVO programming is split between various ministries. And and there often is a role for the security services, which, to be frank, causes a lot of distrust because they're heavy-handed approaches. So it has to be done in a thoughtful way. Otherwise, it doesn't matter how sophisticated a program is, it doesn't have a successful chance to be implemented. The other thing is, and I think this has to be said, it has to be done in an ethical way. If you're designing interventions, pro-social interventions for people who are at risk in the community, it should be done in the same way that other kind of medical interventions are done or mental health interventions are done. From an ethical perspective, the approach is to help people to rehabilitate them. If it's seen as surveillance or spying, which some CVE programs has been labeled as, including here in the United States, then the programs don't have a good chance of success.
Thank you. Thank you. Please, you have a question.
So thank you both for your talks today. I found them really enlightening. I think for me and a lot of other folks who grew up in the States and are around right now, a lot of what you both said resonates with particular focus on groups like incels, self-identified so-called incels. But is that accurate, first of all? And are there faith and community leaders in the US, to your experience, who can provide the sort of guidance that you're talking about, can do this sort of programming? And how can communities work to build that kind of solidarity to support at-risk youth or people who are at risk of being radicalized, especially in the online forums that we're seeing more and more of today?
Go ahead, take a step.
One of the things that's very important, particularly in the United States, is continuing education for people who are in helping professions, right? Mental health professionals, psychologists, psychiatrists, clinical social workers. They're required to have a certain hour of continuing education credits each year in order to maintain their licensure, right? So when I was involved in helping to design programs for CVE, PCE in the United States, we very much wanted to take this perspective. But yes, it makes sense to involve people in the mental health field, but they need to receive the training, right? So I would say the people who are involved in pastoral counseling or religious or faith leaders who are involved in the United States or elsewhere, yeah, sure, they play an important role because they are gatekeepers in their community, champions in their community, but they have to have training, they have to know what they're doing, they have to understand. And that involves continuing education. And that's not just a visit by someone from a public health agency or from a law enforcement agency, that's actual training. And if they get that training, a certain amount of training, then I think they're qualified to do it. But just one or two visits and kind of briefings, it's not going to be enough.
I would just say that the context for the question, actually, I was hoping for a U.S. context question. I think the context in the U.S. is very different from North Africa. Some parallels with our European folks, but we can talk about. I mean, CVE is such a loaded word. I don't want to be associated with anything that is CVE. I always keep repeating it because of the history. The history of how CVE programming was founded in this country and in Europe, and it's got actually transferred from Europe to the models of the States and the surveillance and then what. I mean, the list is super long. However, having said all of that, I think it's very important to be able to have these types of conversations and to look at one of the earlier is that we need to ensure that we look at all forms of extremism, and we can't just close our eyes and say it doesn't exist. It does exist, but that means to not only focus on Daesh type or Al-Qaeda type violent extremism, but also the threats that a lot of our young Muslims feel that they the Islamophobia or the bullying that Muslim Americans face in school, or feeling that they are a problem. And I think this is really serious what it does to the psyche, especially if you speak about trauma, but imagine someone born after 9/11 in the United States and hearing all the time in school or being called names and the impact that that has on them. So looking at that aspect and at the same time being able to raise awareness. So when I was working, we had religious community leaders from the United States with us in the program. And it was it was very challenging because just to build trust to say this is not a CVE program, I promise you it's not. This is more of a, a grassroots approach on preventing violent extremism, addressing all forms of extremism is very important. But once you have that trust, then you're able to do really great things. And so one important thing is creating a safe space, feeling like this is a safe space, that it's a community-led program where, you're able to speak with the youth about the dangers of extremism or about bullying, that they can come and speak with you. One of the imams who participated in our trainings, we did a session, we brought a former white supremacist, and we had a panel on the role of toxic masculinity in white supremacy and in Daesh organizations, and looked at the parallels. There's nothing unique, like violent extremism does not, doesn't belong to a particular group of people. And that enabled to have, real deep conversations. And this imam from Atlanta, he hears now, he went back to his mosque and he did something really beautiful. He did this session, he called his congregation, young men, and did a session of what does, from toxic masculinity to prophetic masculinity, what does it mean? So looking back into our own traditions and, reclaiming our own tradition for the betterment of our communities. And I think that's really important.
Thank you very much. Jackie, you had a question.
Yeah, first of all, thank you. Very interested in this topic, and also worked in the area for a lot of years, but it just keeps evolving, and so I really appreciate your thoughts. One question I had, so Peter, you mentioned approximately 40 to 60% of a certain group that were studying had experienced childhood trauma. And then you mentioned about the vast extent of recruitment strategies that focus on humiliation. And so we have, large segments of populations all over the world that have experienced trauma or humiliation or both or some combination, but only a small percentage choose violence to address those underlying aspects. So my question is, are we focusing on the extremism and the ideologies and the triggers as opposed to kind of filters? How do we stop people who are at violence? So focusing on the V instead of the E. And are there specific programs that really hone in on that aspect? Or are we missing? We're trying to cover all the fish in the sea as opposed to just the sharks.
It's an excellent question. From the public health perspective, the goal is to identify the protective factors as well as the risk factors. So obviously, that's kind of two sides of the same coin. Humiliation is an important factor. One of the things that I think a trauma-informed perspective helps, and brought this into the toolkit, is to say that if you teach people to have awareness of what's going on in their bodies, they're grounded in their bodies, it's called interoceptive awareness or knowledge of bodily sensations. You can actually teach people when someone tells you something that makes you feel anxious or excited or angry, you will be able to sense that your heart rate has increased, right? Pay attention to when your heart rate is increased and don't respond. Don't make any response. So people are taught, recognize what's going on in your body, but don't have any reaction. That's what bodily awareness is. It's awareness of what's going on, but not an immediate or thoughtless reaction. That's how they can be alone. But more globally, yes, it's about identifying the protective factors as well as the risk factors. And that will vary amongst individuals and communities and who they can identify them. But I think if they are looking at those, look through those, they can reach a lot.
Very quickly, I agree with you. And I would say in terms of my experience on PVE issues, it's also mapping the different types of communities. So humiliation is just one part of it. So I'll give you a quick example. we were working with the community and religious faith-based leaders, and they were saying to me a story of a convert who is an imam, and he told me, Huda, Eid and Ramadan, for example, especially Eid, he said the Eid is one of the most depressing holidays for converts. And I'm like, why? He's like, because when converts, they get like their 2 months of like, wow, by the community, and like they're like the prize, everyone wants to show them around. He's like, after it gets lonely, a lot of times we lost our families, our friends, etc., etc. And if you look at the French context specifically, around 30% European context, around 28-30% of converts joined. The ones who joined that were European, 30% of them were converts, 28-30%. So what he did was, as an imam, he felt that there were no support system for newly converts. And so what he did is he did an association where he brought a psychologist, a social worker, and the imam. And they basically stayed with the new converts for a period of like a year or so to accompany them so they cannot be easily preyed. So I'm giving you this example to just tell you like it's really very hyper-local depending on the specific context. And so there isn't like a particular template that we have used.
Right. We're almost at the end. If you have another question, go ahead.
Jeremy Barker from Religious Freedom Institute. Thank you. One of the things you mentioned both on the pull factor side and on the push factor side, the element of on the pull side of the kind of the strong or freedom to practice your religion openly. And then on the push factor goes social exclusion, isolation, the perceived romanticization of religion. How does that play into programmatic side and even kind of advocacy with governments and others, and kind of that restrictive space on religion? Is that recognized as a contributing factor, and kind of how have you seen that addressed?
And it's very contradictory with governments, because a lot of times, and I'm being honest, a lot of times with the project, for example, it spoke on Islamophobia and the rising tide of white supremacy, and we had specific governments that said, you can pull this component off and we would be able to fund. But and we're like, no, it's a comprehensive approach. All this to say that it's very easy when the boogeyman is the Muslim brown man, unfortunately. But that's how it works in the international community, even how we apply the word terrorism. So in our approach, when we're working with community leaders, we also say, how can you give agency to young Muslims, specifically the ones who are living in the West, where they feel that they are empowered and proud of them being Muslim Americans or Muslim Europeans and not having to bargain or negotiate or have to hide it. So some of the things that community leaders do is these programs where that is all about civic engagement, where young people feel that they have a voice and that they're able to contribute to their society, and it's not in contradiction, their faith is not in contradiction of where they come from or where they belong. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Two questions here. I just wanted to come to both of you. First, Amina and the bill. But before I get to Amina, I wanted to ask a question, if that's okay. The field used loosely, PVE and peace building. Can I throw in peace building? The instructions, the curriculum, the developing and designing a program, the M&E, So when you say gendered approach to the preventing violent extremism, could you say a word on that? Like, what does that really mean to you? And have you seen something that's been designed with gender approach and gender based that is a good use and to advertise so we can think about it and look it up?
Thanks for asking this question, my favorite. Yes, actually, the program methodology, the methodology that we use to hope, to share these lessons learned. So for me, gendered approach, a lot of times I get really bothered because I feel like a lot of institutions have just like this checklist.
Yeah.
Okay, we got the women. we have gender. And the way we think of the way I try to develop the PVE project at the Carter Center and at the gendered approach is making sure that we look at recruitment, for example, the substance recruitment, how Daesh recruits women, the role of women in prevention, and the role of in recruitment, so it's not in or, it's not black and white, it's much more complicated than that. But we also said a lot of times when we look at gender and PPE, the onus is on women only, but that's not what gender is. But how about, the majority that have joined Daesh are young men? So we also looked at the role of toxic masculinity before it became the buzzword, now it's common. But we looked at it about 2 years ago on how can we understand the role of toxic masculinity even within these violent extremism movements, not only in Daesh, but also in white supremacy groups. So that's one, so the substance. The second one is the community and the faith-based leaders. We try to ensure it was very hard to have a 50-50 ratio, but at least we had a 45 to 55 ratio between female and male. That was very important. And sometimes to ensure participation of women, because they have a lot of times more social responsibilities, that we have to ensure that we provide some possibilities for them, make it easier for them to be able to participate and be self-conscious about it. The other thing is we never had a workshop with only male experts, never. So all of our experts, we tried to have like a balance between male and female experts, which was in of itself showcasing to the community leaders that we were working with, look, this is the example.
Exactly.
We also tried to make sure that the first workshop, the first cohort, the first group, the women that we selected were leaders in of themselves. So they had the confidence to speak in the workshop with the male religious leaders and not their Muslim be. And then in our Yemeni expert is from the Carter Center. So we tried to really think of it from a 360 approach.
Thank you. Thank you much. Amina, a question.
So this is about the analysis of the videos. I was wondering, to what extent did you look at the role of the logo and the use of the words Muhammad and Allah and like taking off if counted as religious? And when looking at, I saw that in the pie charts, I think it said like 8% was religious rhetoric and then like 70% was military jihad. But for those who would argue, there are some who study that term and then would say that military jihad, like they would say that there's a space for that within religious context, and then how would you be able to respond to those folks in describing the differences?
This is a very good question. So in terms of we looked at 30 different types of variables within the analysis of Daesh. We also looked at all of the Daesh used, and we tried to organize them into Madani and Mekki and try to see which ones that keep coming up and give them to our faith-based leaders that we were working with. In terms of, we didn't have time, but in terms of even military jihad, in other languages, so this is the slide that I showed with military jihad, were videos in all languages. But if you divide the videos into different languages that they use, you can see that the military jihad either increases or decreases. It's higher in Arabic-speaking videos and lower in others. One of the things we try to make in terms of distinctions between the different variables, the narratives. So in terms of argument, what is the main argument? If the main argument is, going to fight for Daesh to become a better Muslim or giving a religious reasoning why we need to join, that was counted as religious. But if the video was showcasing just, you need to fight and the grievances were political grievances, then it was not considered to be religious because the grievances were political, or they are on the offensive or on the defensive. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. And so that's how we tried to, to look at them. And early on, when Daesh just started, when it was at its height and it was so, at its height and it felt like it was the champion, the military jihad was very low actually. And a lot of them, the videos didn't have anything. It had to do with, seeing young people together, eating together, go to the soup kitchen, volunteering, go to the hospital. Yeah, there's like this video, which is greetings from the Khilafah land. And, it's like we all belong together and just come here and you can have kids and, everyone, there's cotton candy. So it's not, the videos that we tend to see or the images in the media are only the ones that are like, that focus on specific narratives.
Bill, you have the last question.
Yeah, thank you. So obviously I come at this from the analytical university side a little bit. I advise. I don't do it. I work on programmatic level as much, but I'd like to echo what she said in terms of, we know the funnel approach in recruitment is wrong, and that cookie cutter, the single explanations are wrong. We know all that's wrong, but if there's one common denominator, it's humiliation, even among converts. And what you've got me thinking about is, well, how many of those who have humiliation reasons for getting radicalized have what you would call trauma? Or is it something short of trauma? So that in my mind, there's sort of a Venn diagram there to sort out. I haven't seen the research, but I know that humiliation plays a big role. In terms of the Moroccan approach, I was looking through my phone. I have about 60 slides on this because we got a briefing at Morocco's military training academy on the entire Moroccan approach. It's a big Venn diagram. It was 3 circles, and basically the way Morocco conceives of it. It sort of explains what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong, which is covered very well in Ayn Weinscott's book, a lot of the right and the wrong of it. Is they see it as sort of a legal reform circle, a religious education circle, and a socioeconomic circle. And within that, we can see lots of things going well and going wrongly. But I would suggest that I think they've overemphasized the religious education piece and haven't really met their own rhetoric. Other pieces, and Anne's main point in her book said it's so wrapped in a war on terror framing and language that it's failed in part just for that reason. Her book's called Bureaucratizing Islam, Morocco's War on Terror, and I recommend it to people. But what I would say on top of that is that security forces play a big role in this. Talk to anybody who works in this field. Lack of human rights training for security forces, the security force allergy to security force reform, like we're seeing in Tunisia and Morocco. And then what we found is that the less we talk about reform and the more we talk about civ-mil relations, that seems to be our ticket in. So then when we're doing civ-mil relations, okay, how are the mil side engaging, and are they overcoming some of the problems which you guys are well aware of and I've talked about? And I don't think we figured that out yet. The 2 things that I wanted to ask about is I took a good hard look last year at the jihadi rappers, and they play a big role in recruitment. They were big in all ISIS recruitment. A lot of them went to Syria. A lot of the people who were attracted by it. I was just wondering if you looked, in addition to the videos and the Dubiak issues, at their rappers, like the softer ones like Fundamental or Abdulmadik and some of the others, and because they rap in German, French, they rap in all the languages. And the other thing I wanted to ask about was we had an event yesterday at CSIS with some of the top U.S. government, Homeland Security people, and that side of it. And what they were most freaked out about, and this gets back to your conversation, was how fast people are radicalizing now. So what used to take years now takes months. So there's a very quick move from being converted or recruited to the movement to action. And there's another study done by Professor AU that said basically returning foreign fighters and other jihadi recruits usually act within 6 months. And so as we think about these interventions, we have to think about the pace of radicalization and bake that in. And so what are we doing to deal with the speed in which new recruits are?
Yeah.
That's
I think it deals with one of the points you made, which is being adaptive to the various changes of the different scenarios of whether they are returning back or they're being recruited, what's the life cycle of this radicalization and post-radicalization. Are programs adapted? Are they just made up at the moment? There's no sense of real depth, approach to it. There's nothing deep. It's just a quick response, a Band-Aid approach to it. So I think that needs to be examined. I'm not sure if we're there at the moment, but I know there's about a dozen rehab reintegration programs from North Africa to Singapore, of all places, right? And there's some studies comparing these approaches. But no one has really come out and said this is the best and most effective way. Each state says they have the most effective, most efficient way, the most 360 approach to bringing the individual back into society. Sort of like the old, what they call DDR, right? With the term in the 70s, right, or 60s.
They still use it.
They still use it, but not
Not the same way.
Not the same way. Not the same way. In fact, DDR was more approach to militias and to liberation movements or terrorist movements, depending on approach and terminology. So this is something different, right? This is, again, includes community approaches, includes imams involved, includes religious leaders, includes counselors and psychologists and so forth. I think the verdict is not out at the moment. Anyone quick response to any of these questions or comments?
I threw a bunch of things out there.
So you threw a bunch of things. Can't
I'm
resist.
just gonna make one quick statement.
Sure.
I think what's important is to realize that how the international, like how we talk about things on an international scale, how they translate into the communities. So if we're talking about, I feel very uncomfortable having one, like one factor and saying, I'm gonna focus on just humiliation. I really feel uncomfortable because I know like doctors who have gone to Daesh and there was no humiliation. So I have to.
I started with that.
Yeah,
There's no
absolutely.
one.
But I think one of the things that we have to think about, the people working on these issues on the ground, is how do these international frameworks or these templates work? How are they received within the communities? And are they benefiting the communities as what we talk about? I think that's really something to keep in mind because sometimes it's two different realities from a very community perspective to on the international front.
Peter and last one.
For the toolkit that I showed, we did do a big thing about the use of music and how one of the things that goes on during the singing and chanting is a relaxation response. And how people sometimes are vulnerable to recording like machines or rap songs, and that PCB efforts also have to use strategic use of singing and music and a preventative one.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, for taking the time to join us in the conversation. And thank you all for coming. Thank you for joining our first event here in DC. First appreciation to 2-3 individuals in particular. Of course, one is Kareem Makhlouf, our executive director. I have not introduced him. He's standing there with the red tie. Sabrina over there is our research associate sitting at the table, making sure you came in. And lastly, Minajot, who did almost everything. And to our larger CGP team with the social media, the photography, the mics, thank you very much for all your help. Really appreciate it. And if you want to have more information about subscribing to our events, just somewhere you can sign in. Thank you again. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much. This was your first event, DC.